It was a crisp Monday morning when James Richardson stepped into his massive walk-in closet, pushing past his collection of designer suits. Today was different. Instead of his usual sharp business attire, he pulled out a simple navy blue sweater and comfortable jeans. Looking in the mirror, he smiled. Nobody would guess he was the owner of 5 airlines and CEO of the newest addition to his fleet, Skyway Airlines. His phone buzzed with messages from his executive team, but James had already made up his mind. For months, he'd been hearing whispers about service issues on certain routes, and customer complaints that made him uncomfortable. Some passengers had reported unfair treatment, and as a black man who'd faced his share of discrimination while climbing the corporate ladder, he took these concerns seriously. "Sometimes you need to see things for yourself," he muttered, adjusting his sweater. His wife had called him crazy when he shared his plan to fly incognito on one of his planes. "You're worth billions, honey. Why put yourself through this?" She'd asked over breakfast yesterday, but James believed in hands-on leadership. How else would he really know what his passengers experienced? He booked a first-class ticket under James Smith, a common enough name that wouldn't raise eyebrows. Flight 247, Dallas to Chicago. His executive assistant nearly had a heart attack when he cleared his schedule for the day, but James knew this was necessary. At the airport, he walked through the terminal like any other passenger. No VIP treatment, no special escorts, no priority lines. He waited in the security queue, making small talk with a grandmother heading to see her grandkids. When someone bumped into him without apologizing, he simply smiled, the same treatment any regular traveler would get. The boarding area for Flight 247 was packed. James sat quietly, watching his own staff at work. The gate agents were efficient but seemed stressed. He made mental notes. Maybe they needed more support during peak hours. A young mom struggling with a baby stroller caught his attention. He helped her fold it, earning a grateful smile. First-class boarding was announced, and James stood up, clutching his basic carry-on bag. The gate agent barely glanced at his boarding pass, waving him through. As he walked down the jet bridge, his heart beat a little faster. This wasn't nerves, it was excitement. In his 20 years of building his airline empire, he'd never seen it quite like this, from the ground up. What he didn't know was that this ordinary Monday was about to become anything but ordinary. As he approached the aircraft door, he spotted flight attendant Karen Miller's name tag. She'd been with the airline for 15 years, and in the next few hours, she would turn his simple observation flight into a national conversation about prejudice in the airline industry. But for now, James was just another passenger, stepping onto one of his own planes in complete anonymity. He'd chosen seat 2A, not his usual spot when flying as CEO. A small smile played on his lips as he thought about the story he'd tell his wife later. Little did he know, this story would be very different from the simple customer service check he'd planned. The familiar smell of airplane cabin and fresh coffee filled his nostrils as he made his way to his seat. Other first-class passengers were already settling in, arranging their expensive bags and logging into their devices. James took out his old paperback novel, another part of his casual passenger disguise. Everything was perfect for his undercover mission. He was just another customer, about to experience his own airline's service firsthand. If only he knew that in the next few hours, this routine flight would spark a chain of events that would change not just his airline, but the entire industry's approach to customer service and equality. But for now, he simply sat back, opened his book, and waited for the flight to begin. The moment James settled into his first-class seat, he could feel something was off. Flight attendant Karen Miller did a double take as she passed by, her welcoming smile freezing for just a second too long. He'd seen that look before, the one that said, "You don't belong here." Karen had been having what she considered a perfect morning until now. Her first-class cabin was filled with her usual type of passengers: business executives in crisp suits and wealthy tourists with designer bags. Then James walked in, wearing his casual sweater and carrying a worn paperback novel. "Your boarding pass, sir." Karen's voice carried that artificial sweetness that barely masked her suspicion. James handed it over calmly, having dealt with similar situations countless times before. She studied it like a detective examining evidence, turning it over and holding it up to the light. "Is there a problem?" James asked politely, though he already knew the answer. Around them, other passengers were settling in, some watching the interaction with uncomfortable glances. "Oh, no. It's just that we need to be very careful about seating arrangements in first class," Karen replied, emphasizing the words first class as if they were something sacred. She checked the boarding pass again, her lips pressed into a thin line. A businessman across the aisle raised his eyebrows at the scene, his expression a mix of embarrassment and discomfort. He'd been welcomed aboard with nothing more than a warm smile and a quick glance at his ticket. "I fly this route quite often," James mentioned casually, knowing full well he owned the entire airline. "I've never had my boarding pass checked quite so thoroughly before." Karen's smile tightened. "Well, we've had some issues with passengers getting confused about their seats lately." She paused, then added with fake concern, "The economy section is actually quite comfortable too." James noticed how she didn't make similar suggestions to any other first-class passengers. He pulled out his phone, pretending to check emails while actually making mental notes about the interaction. As a CEO, he'd implemented numerous training programs about customer service and discrimination, but clearly, something wasn't working. The pre-flight routine continued around them. Other flight attendants moved through the cabin, offering magazines and water to passengers. Karen seemed to hover near James's seat, watching his every move as if expecting him to cause trouble. When the drink service began, Karen's treatment became even more obvious. She served everyone else in first class before finally turning to James. "Oh, I almost forgot," she said loudly enough for others to hear. "Would you like anything to drink?" James maintained his composure, years of boardroom negotiations coming in handy. "Just water, please," he replied with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. She returned with a plastic cup of water, while other passengers sipped from glass tumblers. A small detail, but one that spoke volumes. The businessman across the aisle noticed too, frowning slightly at the obvious difference in service. Throughout these interactions, James kept his cool, though inside he felt a familiar mix of disappointment and determination. Every time he experienced situations like this, it reminded him why he'd worked so hard to reach his position. He had the power to change things now, but first, he needed to understand exactly how deep the problem went. The plane began its taxi to the runway, and Karen made one final pass through the cabin, checking seatbelts. She stopped at James's row, tugging his belt with unnecessary force. "Safety first," she said with that same artificial smile. Little did Karen know, her actions were being observed not just by a regular passenger, but by someone who could reshape her entire career. As the plane lifted off the ground, James glanced out the window, knowing this flight was about to become much more than a simple customer service check. The real drama was yet to unfold, and Karen's behavior was only the beginning of what would become a powerful lesson about prejudice, power, and the importance of treating everyone with dignity and respect. An hour into the flight, the difference in service had become impossible to ignore. While other first-class passengers enjoyed their hot towels and warm nuts, James's call button went unanswered for 20 minutes. He watched as Karen fussed over everyone else, topping up their drinks and asking if they needed anything, while somehow becoming conveniently blind to his presence. The smell of fresh-cooked meals wafted through the cabin as lunch service began. Karen moved from row to row, her voice warm and friendly as she confirmed everyone's pre-ordered meals. When she finally reached James, her demeanor changed completely. "I'm so sorry," she said, not sounding sorry at all, "but it seems we don't have a record of your meal preference." She shuffled through her papers with exaggerated concern. "We only have the standard economy meal available for you." James knew for a fact that first-class flights always carried extra premium meals. He'd implemented that policy himself after a catering mishap last year. "That's strange," he said calmly. "I definitely selected my meal when I booked." The businessman across the aisle, who had been watching these interactions with growing discomfort, spoke up. "I didn't pre-order either, but you found a meal for me just fine." Karen's face flushed slightly, but she quickly recovered. "Well, that was the last extra meal we had." She turned back to James with a tight smile. "I can bring you something from economy class if you're hungry." James declined politely, making another mental note. Around him, passengers were starting to notice the pattern. A woman 2 rows ahead kept glancing back, her expression a mix of sympathy and embarrassment. An elderly couple whispered to each other, shaking their heads disapprovingly at Karen's behavior. The flight hit some turbulence, and Karen used it as an excuse to rush past James' requests for water. "We need to wait until it's safer," she told him firmly. Yet moments later, she was happily serving drinks to other passengers, somehow managing to keep her balance perfectly fine. A younger flight attendant, noticing the situation, tried to help. She approached James with a friendly smile, offering him a drink, but Karen quickly intercepted her. "I'll handle first class," she said sharply, sending the younger attendant away with a stern look. "Standards," Karen muttered under her breath as she passed James's seat again. "We have to maintain certain standards." She said it just loud enough for him to hear, but not quite loud enough to be called out for it. The businessman across the aisle had enough. "Excuse me," he called out to Karen. I couldn't help but notice, but James raised his hand slightly, giving him a small smile and a slight shake of his head. This wasn't the first time he experienced such treatment, and he had a different way of handling it in mind. As the flight continued, Karen's behavior became more obvious. She'd practically bump into James's seat while serving others, never apologizing. When she handed out warm cookies to first-class passengers, she somehow ran out just before reaching his row. Through it all, James maintained his composure, documenting every interaction on his phone under the guise of sending emails. Each incident would later become part of a larger conversation about change and accountability. The real twist was still coming, the coffee incident that would change everything. But for now, James watched as Karen continued her subtle campaign of discrimination, unaware that her actions were being observed by the one person who could reshape not just her career, but the entire airline's approach to customer service. Other passengers were becoming increasingly uncomfortable with the situation. The elderly couple had started recording subtle videos on their phones. The businessman had pulled out his business card, clearly wanting to report the incident. The tension in first class was building, like a pot slowly coming to boil. And through it all, Karen remained oblivious to the fact that her target wasn't just any passenger, but the owner of the very airline that signed her paychecks. Her next action would turn this subtle discrimination into a career-ending moment, but she didn't know that yet. For now, she continued her practices, confident in her position and unaware of the storm about to break. As the flight entered its final hour, the tension in first class had reached its peak. James pressed his call button for the third time, hoping to finally get a cup of coffee. He'd been watching other passengers enjoy their second and third cups while his requests went ignored. "Is there something you need?" Karen's voice dripped with artificial sweetness as she finally approached his seat. The exhaustion of maintaining her act was starting to show in the tight lines around her eyes. "Yes, I'd appreciate a cup of coffee, please," James said politely, matching her fake smile with his genuine one. "Black, no sugar." "Of course," she replied, turning sharply on her heel. Other passengers watched the interaction closely now, sensing something was about to happen. The businessman across the aisle had his phone discreetly positioned, recording what he probably thought would be yet another example of poor service. Karen returned moments later, carrying a cup of steaming coffee. Her hands were shaking slightly, but not from nervousness, from anger. She'd spent 15 years in first class, creating what she considered a perfect environment. And something about James's continued politeness in the face of her behavior seemed to infuriate her even more. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. As she approached James's seat, she deliberately caught her foot on nothing at all. The coffee cup tilted, and hot liquid poured directly onto James's face and chest. The navy blue sweater he wore darkened instantly with the stain. Gasps echoed through the cabin. The elderly couple 3 rows ahead jumped to their feet. The businessman dropped all pretense of discretion and openly filmed the scene. A young woman nearby rushed forward with napkins. "Oh my." Karen's voice was loud, theatrical. "I am so sorry. These things happen sometimes." She dabbed half-heartedly at his sweater with a single napkin, adding in a whisper meant only for him, "Maybe this isn't the right section for you after all." James sat perfectly still, coffee dripping from his chin onto his chest. The liquid was hot. Not hot enough to cause serious burns, but enough to sting uncomfortably. Yet his face remained calm, almost eerily so. "I'd like to speak to your lead flight attendant," he said quietly, his voice level and controlled. Something in his tone made Karen pause. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed her face. The younger flight attendant who had tried to help earlier rushed forward with a first aid kit and more napkins. "Sir, I'm so sorry. Let me help you clean up. Do you need medical attention?" "Get back to your section," Karen snapped at her colleague, but the younger attendant stood her ground this time. "This is a serious incident," the younger attendant said firmly. "I'm calling the lead flight attendant." Phones were out all around the cabin now. The incident had gone from subtle discrimination to obvious assault in seconds. The businessman was already typing an email on his phone. The elderly couple had moved to seats closer to James, offering him their own napkins and words of support. Through it all, James remained composed, though his eyes never left Karen's face. He pulled out his phone, made a quick call, and spoke just 6 words. "We'll be meeting at the gate." Karen's face showed the first signs of real worry. Something about his tone, his composure, the way other staff members were suddenly gathering around. It all seemed to suggest she'd made a terrible mistake. The lead flight attendant arrived, profusely apologizing and documenting the incident. But James just sat quietly, coffee-stained but dignified, occasionally glancing at his watch as if counting down to something. The rest of the passengers in first class had formed an unofficial support group around him. The businessman offered his spare shirt from his carry-on. The elderly couple insisted on being witnesses for any complaint he wanted to file. As the plane began its descent into Chicago, Karen's confident demeanor had completely crumbled. She kept glancing nervously at James, then at the cabin door, then back at James. Something about his calm demeanor and that quick phone call had finally pierced through her prejudice, replacing it with growing dread. Little did she know, her worst fears were about to be confirmed. In just 30 minutes, she would discover exactly who she had chose to discriminate against, and her entire world would change forever. The plane touched down in Chicago with a tension you could cut with a knife. James sat quietly in his coffee-stained sweater, while Karen nervously shuffled around the cabin, avoiding eye contact with everyone. The younger flight attendant had provided him with a full incident report form, which he was carefully filling out, much to Karen's visible distress. As the plane taxied to the gate, something unusual caught everyone's attention. Through the windows, passengers could see 3 black corporate SUVs parked on the tarmac. Men in suits stood waiting, and even from a distance, their presence screamed executive management. "That's strange," one passenger whispered. "You usually only see that when someone really important is on board." The lead flight attendant's radio crackled to life. After listening for a moment, her eyes widened, and she looked at James with sudden recognition. The color drained from her face as she quickly whispered something to the other flight attendants. Everyone except Karen seemed to understand what was happening. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Please remain seated until our special guest has disembarked." The confusion on Karen's face deepened. She hadn't been informed of any VIP passengers on this flight. As the seatbelt sign turned off, James stood up calmly, his coffee-stained sweater now a badge of what he'd endured. The businessman who'd witnessed everything reached out to shake his hand. "I've got everything recorded," he said quietly, "just in case you need it for your complaint." James smiled warmly. "I appreciate that, but I don't think we'll need recordings where this is going." The elderly couple who had been watching everything unfold chimed in. "We'll be witnesses if you need us, dear. What happened today was simply unacceptable." As James moved toward the front of the plane, the younger flight attendant who had tried to help him earlier opened the aircraft door. The looks of recognition on the faces of the waiting ground staff said it all. "Welcome back, Mr. Richardson," the station manager said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "We've been expecting you." The sound of dropping papers came from behind. Karen had finally connected the dots. The passenger she'd been discriminating against all flight, the man whose face she doused with coffee, was James Richardson, the owner of the entire airline. Phones came out instantly as passengers realized what was happening. The businessman could be heard explaining to his seatmate. "That's the billionaire who bought this airline last year. He started as a baggage handler 20 years ago and built his own cargo company from scratch." Karen stood frozen, her face a mask of horror as she watched various airline executives greeting James with deep respect. The coffee stains on his sweater seemed to stand out even more now, a glaring testament to her actions. The younger flight attendant stepped forward. "Mr. Richardson, I'm so sorry about what happened today. I should have done more to prevent it." James shook his head kindly. "You tried to help. That's what matters. We'll be having a company-wide meeting about today's events." He turned to address all the crew members present. "What happened today isn't just about one incident. It's about the culture we create and the values we uphold." As he prepared to leave, James turned back one last time, looking directly at Karen, who seemed to be having trouble staying on her feet. "Please ensure everyone involved stays at the gate. HR will want to conduct interviews, and I believe we have some serious discussions ahead about the future of our airline's customer service policies." Passengers began sharing their videos and photos on social media even before they left their seats. The story of the airline owner who went undercover and experienced discrimination firsthand was about to go viral. Walking toward the terminal, James pulled out his phone to call his wife. "Remember how you said this undercover flight was a crazy idea?" he said as he climbed into one of the waiting SUVs. "Well, honey, you're not going to believe what just happened." Behind him, Karen sat down heavily in a crew seat, realizing that in trying to put someone in their place, she had instead revealed everything about herself to the worst possible person she could have chosen as a target. The airport terminal buzzed with activity as news of the incident spread like wildfire. James sat in a private airline lounge, still wearing his coffee-stained sweater, surrounded by anxious executives. Their faces showed a mix of embarrassment and concern as they watched videos of the incident playing on various phones. "Sir, we can handle this quietly," one executive suggested, sliding a document across the table. "We could offer compensation to keep this out of the media." James held up his hand, stopping the conversation. "That's exactly what we're not going to do. This isn't about covering up one incident. This is about fixing a broken system." Down at the gate, Karen sat trembling in a corner, watching as HR representatives interviewed other crew members. The younger flight attendant was showing them her notes about similar incidents she'd witnessed over the past months. The lead flight attendant was explaining how she'd received complaints before, but hadn't taken strong enough action. Passengers from the flight lingered nearby, sharing their videos and stories with airline officials. The businessman who'd recorded everything handed over his footage refusing the airline's offer of free flights. "Just make sure this leads to real change," he said firmly. The elderly couple who'd witnessed everything stayed to give their statement. "We've been flying this airline for 30 years, the wife explained to a reporter who'd already shown up. "Never did we imagine we'd see such behavior, and never did we imagine the owner himself would experience it firsthand." Social media was exploding. Someone had posted a side-by-side photo. James in his usual CEO attire speaking at a business conference, and James in his coffee-stained sweater sitting calmly in the first-class cabin. The caption read, "Sometimes leaders have to experience problems to understand them." Back in the lounge, James was already turning this crisis into an opportunity for change. "Get me every customer complaint about discrimination from the past year," he instructed his team. "Every single one, not just the ones that made it past middle management." Karen was finally called into a private room for her interview. As she walked past the lounge, she caught a glimpse of James through the glass walls. He was standing now, his coffee-stained sweater a stark reminder of her actions, talking intensely with his management team. "I didn't know," she kept whispering to herself. "How was I supposed to know?" But that was exactly the point. She wasn't supposed to know. No passenger should be treated differently, regardless of who they might be. The airport was getting busier as the afternoon flights arrived, but the area around Gate A7 remained unusually quiet. Airline staff whispered among themselves, sharing details of what had happened. Some looked worried, wondering if they too had shown biases they weren't aware of. James's phone kept buzzing with messages from other airline CEOs. Word had spread quickly through the industry. This wasn't just about one airline anymore. It was about to become a conversation about discrimination in air travel as a whole. A young employee brought James a fresh shirt, but he declined to change. "The stains stay for now," he said firmly. "They're a reminder of why we're here." By late afternoon, the airline's PR team had prepared a statement, but James rejected their careful corporate wording. Instead, he wrote his own message. "Today, I experienced firsthand what some of our passengers face. This ends now. Real change starts tomorrow." Karen, leaving her interview, looked years older than she had that morning. As she walked past the customer service desk, she saw her own face on someone's phone screen. A passenger's photo of her pouring coffee had already gone viral. The story was picking up momentum. News vans were arriving outside the terminal. Inside, James continued his meetings, turning this incident into a catalyst for change. His coffee-stained sweater would become a symbol of this day, the day when discrimination in his airline met its match. As evening approached, James finally called his wife again. "Remember how I said this undercover flight would help me understand our airline better?" he said quietly. "Well, it did more than that. It's about to change everything." The sun set over Chicago O'Hare Airport, but inside, the story was far from over. This was just the beginning of a much bigger transformation, and everyone knew it. The next morning, James walked into the airline's headquarters wearing the same coffee-stained sweater. Employees stopped and stared as he passed, the dark stains now a powerful symbol of what needed to change. The usual morning buzz of the office was replaced by a tense silence. In the main conference room, department heads sat nervously around the table. They'd spent all night reviewing years of customer complaints, finding patterns they'd previously ignored. On the wall-mounted screens, social media continued to explode with the story. The video of the coffee incident had reached millions of views overnight. "I've read every single complaint from the past year," James began, his voice calm but firm. "This isn't just about one flight attendant. This is about a culture we've allowed to grow." He placed a thick folder on the table. "These are just the complaints that made it through our system. How many more went unreported?" The head of customer service shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "Sir, we've always had anti-discrimination policies in place." "Policies aren't enough," James replied, touching the coffee stain on his sweater. I could fire Karen today. That would be easy. But would it solve the real problem? Instead of immediate termination, James unveiled a comprehensive plan. The airline would shut down for one full day next week, something unheard of in the industry. Every employee, from baggage handlers to pilots, would attend mandatory anti-bias training. We're losing millions by shutting down for a day, one executive protested. We're losing our humanity by staying open without fixing this, James responded, silencing the room. In another part of the building, Karen sat in HR, tears streaming down her face as she watched videos of herself from the flight. The younger flight attendant's detailed notes showed a pattern of behavior she'd never acknowledged before. I didn't realize, Karen whispered, watching herself deliberately ignore James' requests on screen. I didn't think I was. That's exactly the problem, the HR director replied gently. None of us think we are, until we're forced to really look at ourselves. James's plan went further than just training. He announced the creation of a new customer advocacy board, made up of diverse frequent flyers who would have direct input into company policies. The younger flight attendant who had tried to help during the incident was appointed to lead a new internal review committee. The story continued to spread. Other airlines started calling, asking about James's approach. Instead of hiding the incident, he was turning it into an industry-wide wake-up call. By afternoon, James had personally recorded a video message to all employees. He still wore the stained sweater. This isn't about shame or blame, he said, looking directly into the camera. This is about growth, about being better tomorrow than we were yesterday. Karen was given a choice: resign or complete an extensive rehabilitation program that would include working with diverse passenger groups and sharing her story as a teaching tool. The decision would be hers, but either way, she would never serve in first class again. Sometimes it takes a dramatic event to open our eyes, James told his management team later that day. But shame alone doesn't create change. Action does. The coffee-stained sweater was framed and hung in the company's main lobby with a simple plaque. Every passenger deserves first-class respect. It would serve as a daily reminder to everyone who walked through those doors. As the day wound down, James received an unexpected letter. It was from the businessman who had recorded the incident. I've flown millions of miles, he wrote, but I've never seen a company admit its mistakes and commit to change quite like this. You've turned an ugly incident into a beautiful opportunity for growth. That evening, as James finally changed out of his stained sweater, his wife asked if he regretted taking that flight. He smiled, holding up the garment. This stain revealed something that needed to be seen, he said quietly. Sometimes the most painful moments lead to the most important changes. The next day would bring new challenges, but for now, an entire airline was beginning to look at itself differently. Sometimes leadership means facing uncomfortable truths, even when they're served with coffee. The story exploded across the nation over the next few days. Morning shows fought to get James as a guest, but he declined them all. Instead, he focused on real change, not publicity. Watch this, a college student told his friends, holding up his phone. The coffee incident video had gone viral on every social platform. But unlike most viral videos that fade away, this one sparked serious conversations. Comment sections filled with people sharing their own travel experiences, both good and bad. Major newspapers picked up the story with headlines like CEO's undercover flight reveals ugly truth, and coffee incident sparks industry-wide change. But what made this story different was what happened next. Other airline executives started reaching out. Your story made us look at our own numbers, one CEO wrote to James. We found similar patterns. We need to do better. The younger flight attendant who had tried to help during the incident became an unexpected hero. Her inbox filled with messages from other airline workers who had witnessed discrimination but stayed silent. Your courage to speak up gives us courage too, one message read. In airport lounges across the country, travelers discussed the incident. Did you hear what happened on that flight? became a common conversation starter. But instead of just sharing the shocking story, people talked about solutions. A popular travel blogger wrote, "We've all seen bad behavior on flights. But this is the first time I've seen a company leader experience it firsthand and turn it into real change instead of just damage control." James received an invitation to speak at a national transportation conference. Instead of sending a polished marketing video, he sent the raw footage from the flight. "This is reality," his note said. "Let's talk about fixing it." The elderly couple who had witnessed everything got invited to join the airline's new customer advocacy board. "We've been flying for 50 years, they told a local newspaper. "Finally, someone is asking passengers what needs to change." Social media couldn't get enough of the story. People shared old photos of James working as a baggage handler 20 years ago, climbing his way up in the industry. His journey from the tarmac to the CEO's office made his undercover flight even more meaningful. The businessman who recorded the incident started a thread online. "I've seen discrimination before and stayed quiet. Never again. Here's what we can all do to speak up." His post got shared thousands of times. Television stations kept playing the clip of James in his coffee-stained sweater addressing his employees. "This isn't about one incident," he said in the video. "This is about changing how we see each other." Karen's story took an unexpected turn. After much thought, she chose the rehabilitation program over resignation. Her first public statement was simple but powerful. "I never saw myself as prejudiced. Watching that video of myself showed me a person I didn't want to be." Other companies outside the airline industry started calling. "If the CEO of an airline can go undercover," one retail executive said, "maybe we all need to see our businesses through our customers' eyes." A month after the incident, a passenger posted a new video from one of the airline's flights. It showed flight attendants going through their service routine, treating everyone with equal respect and care. "This is what change looks like," the caption read. The coffee-stained sweater, now framed in the company lobby, became a symbol that other businesses talked about. "What's your coffee-stained sweater?" became shorthand for asking what uncomfortable truths leaders needed to face. James kept the airline's transformation in the spotlight, but not through flashy PR campaigns. Instead, he shared real stories of change. Employees speaking up against bias, passengers feeling heard, and staff at all levels learning to recognize their own prejudices. As evening news shows prepared their 1 month later follow-up stories, James sat in his office, looking at a photo from the incident. "The stain was temporary," he told a reporter, "but the change it inspired will be permanent." The story had moved beyond just one airline or one incident. It had become a wake-up call for an entire industry, proving that real change doesn't come from policies alone. It comes from leaders willing to experience problems firsthand and brave enough to face uncomfortable truths. 6 months after the coffee incident, the airline industry looked different. What started as one uncomfortable flight had sparked a revolution in customer service and corporate culture. James sat in his office, reviewing the latest company reports. The coffee-stained sweater, now preserved in a frame behind his desk, had become a powerful reminder of that pivotal day. A knock on his door interrupted his thoughts. "You won't believe these numbers," his chief of customer service announced, walking in with a fresh stack of reports. "Complaints about discrimination have dropped by 85% across all our flights. Other airlines are asking to copy our training program." The changes went far beyond just numbers. The younger flight attendant who stood up during the incident now led the company's new Speak Up program, training staff to intervene when they witnessed unfair treatment. Her sessions always started with a coffee incident video, but now it was followed by hundreds of positive stories of change. In the main terminal of Chicago O'Hare, where it all began, a new customer service center stood as a symbol of transformation. Above its entrance hung a simple message: "Every passenger's story matters." Karen had completed her rehabilitation program and chose to share her experience. Instead of hiding in shame, She became an unexpected voice for change. "I was the face of what was wrong," she told a group of new employees. "Now I want to be part of what's right." The airline's new policies became the industry standard. Other companies sent their staff to observe and learn. The elderly couple who witnessed the original incident were now regular speakers at staff training sessions, sharing their perspective as longtime travelers who had seen both the problems and the solutions. The businessman who recorded the incident received a letter from James. Inside was a lifetime airline pass and a note. "Thank you for having the courage to document truth. Your actions helped create change." In airports across the country, passengers noticed the difference. Gone were the days of subtle discrimination and uncomfortable situations. New signs at every gate reminded both staff and travelers. First-class service isn't about where you sit, it's about how you're treated. James continued his undercover flights, but now they told a different story. Videos surfaced of flight attendants going above and beyond for every passenger, regardless of their appearance or seat assignment. These clips went viral too, but for all the right reasons. The younger generation of airline staff embraced the changes wholeheartedly. They wore pins that read, "Everyone's first class," and took pride in making every passenger feel valued. During a final review meeting, James shared something personal with his executive team. "My father was a janitor who saved for months to buy his first plane ticket," he said. "The way he was treated on that flight made him promise never to fly again. Today, I can finally say we're building the airline he deserved to fly on." The story had come full circle. International airlines began adopting similar policies. What started as an ugly incident had transformed into a global movement for better treatment in the skies. 1 year to the day after the incident, James boarded another flight incognito. This time, he watched as every passenger received the same respectful treatment. No double-checking of tickets, no subtle discrimination, just genuine service. As he sat in his seat, a new flight attendant offered him coffee with a warm, genuine smile. "Sir, would you like cream or sugar with that?" she asked, treating him with the same respect she showed to every other passenger. James smiled, thinking about how far they'd come. "Black coffee, please," he replied, "and thank you for asking." The coffee arrived safely this time, served with dignity and respect. As James took a sip, he glanced at his phone. The last email from his team showed record satisfaction scores across all passenger demographics. Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest moments. A cup of coffee had sparked a movement, and now the skies were truly becoming friendly for everyone. The story of the coffee incident would be told for years to come, not as a tale of discrimination, but as the moment when an entire industry learned to see itself through new eyes.